The morning air in London was crisp and cool. The sky was a soft gray, with the sun hiding behind the clouds. People gathered near Buckingham Palace, excited to see the famous royal guards. Tourists held cameras, hoping to capture a special moment. Some whispered to each other, pointing at the tall soldiers in red coats and black furry hats. The guards stood perfectly still, not moving a muscle. In the middle of the crowd, a little girl named Emily held her father's hand. She was only 5 years old, with curly blonde hair and bright blue eyes. But something made her stand out from everyone else. She was still in her pink pajamas. She had been too sleepy to change that morning, and her parents didn't want to argue with her. So there she was, wearing soft, fuzzy pajamas covered in tiny white stars. In her other hand, she held a small stuffed bunny named Mr. Hoppy. Emily had never seen a real soldier before. She stared at the royal guards with wide eyes. "Daddy, why don't they move?" she asked. "They're not allowed to," her father explained. "They have to stand still and guard the palace." Emily thought about this. It seemed very strange to her. Soldiers were supposed to be strong, right? But how could they be strong if they didn't move? As her parents talked to each other, Emily's attention drifted. She looked at the nearest guard, standing tall like a statue. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He didn't even look at anyone. He just stood there, holding a big rifle against his shoulder. Emily felt a strange curiosity inside her. What would happen if she said hello? Would he talk back? Would he smile? She wanted to know. Before she even thought about it, her feet started moving. Step by step, Emily walked away from her parents. The crowd didn't notice her at first. She was small, and everyone was too busy taking pictures. She made her way past people's legs, squeezing between them until she was standing just a few feet from the guard. Now, the crowd started to notice. A few people gasped. Some pointed, whispering to each other. Emily didn't care. She just stared up at the tall soldier with her big blue eyes. Then she lifted her tiny hand and waved. The guard did not move. Emily tilted her head. "Hello," she said softly. Still, no reaction. The crowd was silent now, watching closely. Some people pulled out their phones, sensing something unusual was about to happen. Emily looked down at her bunny, then back at the guard. She took a deep breath and did something no one expected. She took one step closer, then another. Then she reached out her tiny hand and gently tugged on the guard's red coat. A loud gasp spread through the crowd. Would he move? Would he break the rules? Everyone held their breath, waiting for the guard's reaction. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The crowd, the tourists, the noise of the city, everything faded into silence. All eyes were on the little girl in pink pajamas and the royal guard standing before her. Emily stood still, her tiny fingers gripping the edge of the soldier's red coat. She wasn't scared. She wasn't trying to be naughty. She was just curious. The royal guard remained frozen. His face showed no emotion. His hand stayed firmly in place, holding his rifle against his shoulder. The crowd whispered among themselves. "She touched him." Someone murmured. "Is she allowed to do that?" Another person asked. Tourists grabbed their phones, eager to capture the moment. After all, everyone knew the rules. The royal guards did not move. They did not speak. They did not react. No matter what happened around them, they stayed perfectly still, like statues. But then, something unexpected happened. The guard blinked. It was just a small movement, almost unnoticeable. But the crowd saw it. A ripple of excitement passed through them. Was he going to react? Would he break the strict rules? Emily tilted her head and smiled up at him. She wasn't thinking about rules. She wasn't thinking about tourists or cameras. She was just a little girl who wanted to say hello. She lifted Mr. Hoppy, her stuffed bunny, and held him up toward the soldier. "This is Mr. Hoppy," she said in a sweet voice. "He likes your hat." A few people in the crowd chuckled softly. The moment felt both innocent and magical. For a few long seconds, the guard remained motionless. His face was serious, his eyes staring straight ahead. But then, something even more shocking happened. The guard moved. It was a small movement, just a tiny shift in his posture. But to the watching crowd, it felt like the biggest surprise in the world. Slowly, the soldier lowered his gaze, just enough to look at Emily. His eyes, once cold and distant, now held a warmth that hadn't been there before. The crowd gasped. Some people clapped their hands over their mouths. Then, in a moment no one would forget, the guard did something unheard of. He bent his knees, just slightly, and knelt down. Emily's smile grew wider. She didn't know why everyone was so shocked. To her, it felt normal, like meeting a new friend. The tourists were in disbelief. "He moved," a man said, recording everything on his phone. "They never do that," a woman whispered, shaking her head in amazement. The royal guard, now at eye level with Emily, looked at Mr. Hoppy. Then, in a slow, controlled movement, he gave the stuffed bunny a small but official nod, like a knight greeting an important guest. Emily giggled. She turned to the crowd, her face lighting up with happiness. "He said hi," she announced proudly. The crowd erupted into soft laughter, smiles spreading across their faces. What had started as an ordinary visit to Buckingham Palace had turned into something special. But what would happen now? Had the guard broken a rule? Would someone stop him? No one knew. All they knew was that they had witnessed something rare, something heartwarming, something real. And it wasn't over yet. For a moment, everything felt like a dream. The royal guard, known for never moving, had just bent down to acknowledge a little girl in pink pajamas. The crowd, stunned, stood in silence. Some people had their phones raised, recording the rare event. Others simply watched, their faces filled with wonder. Emily, unaware of the rules she had just broken, was beaming. She squeezed Mr. Hoppy in excitement. To her, this was not a serious moment. It was just fun. She looked at the soldier's tall black hat and then back at Mr. Hoppy. "He likes your hat," she repeated, tilting her head. "Do you like his?" The crowd chuckled softly. A few people exchanged amused glances. The guard remained quiet, his face still serious, but something in his eyes had changed. He looked at Emily with a softness no one expected. He did not answer her question, but the fact that he had moved at all was already unbelievable. But then, a sharp, firm sound broke the moment. Clack, clack. The sound of boots hitting the pavement echoed through the air. Another royal guard was marching toward them. The tension in the air grew thick. The crowd shifted nervously. Was this guard coming to stop the other soldier? Was Emily in trouble? Emily's parents, who had been watching in shock, suddenly snapped out of it. Her mother gasped. Her father stepped forward quickly. "Emily, come back here," he said in a gentle but firm voice. Emily blinked in confusion. She looked around at all the adults, sensing their nervousness. "But I was just saying hi," she said softly. The approaching guard kept marching, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. The crowd held its breath. No one knew what would happen next. When he reached the kneeling soldier, he stopped. He looked down at Emily, then at the other guard. His face gave nothing away. Then, with perfect discipline, he lifted his rifle slightly and tapped it against the ground. Everyone froze. Emily tilted her head. "Are you saying hi too?" she asked, her voice innocent and sweet. A few people chuckled nervously. Then, to everyone's surprise, the second guard gave the smallest nod. It was almost unnoticeable, but it was there. A tiny, quick movement of his head. The first soldier, still kneeling, finally straightened his posture and stood back up. He returned to his strict, motionless stance. The moment of softness was over. Emily's father quickly walked over and took her hand. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, trying to pull her back toward the crowd. "Let's give the nice soldiers their space." Emily frowned, confused. She didn't understand why the moment had to end. But she didn't argue. She let her father lead her away. The crowd, still amazed, slowly began to move again. People whispered excitedly, sharing their thoughts on what they had just seen. "That was incredible," one man said. "I've never seen them move like that before," a woman added. As Emily walked away, she looked back one last time. The first guard was standing still again, like nothing had happened. But just before she turned away, she saw something no one else noticed. For a fraction of a second, the guard lifted 2 fingers slightly from his rifle, almost like a secret wave. Emily grinned. She squeezed Mr. Hoppy tight. She knew what she saw, and she would never forget it. Emily's father led her back toward the crowd, his heart still racing. The little girl in pink pajamas had just done something unbelievable. She had made a royal guard move. And not just any move. He had knelt down to acknowledge her. It was a moment that left everyone stunned. The tourists who had witnessed the scene were still buzzing with excitement. Some whispered to each other, while others eagerly checked the videos on their phones. This was something no one would ever forget. But Emily didn't understand why everyone was making such a big deal out of it. To her, she had simply met a new friend. She looked up at her father with big, curious eyes. "Daddy, did I do something wrong?" Her father sighed, kneeling down to her level. "No, sweetheart," he said with a small smile. "But the royal guards have very important jobs. They're not supposed to move or talk to anyone." Emily frowned. "That's silly," she said. "How can they be nice if they don't say hello?" Her mother chuckled softly. "It's just part of their job, darling." Emily looked over her shoulder. The guard she had spoken to was still standing perfectly still. His face was serious again, as if nothing had happened. The second guard, the one who had marched over, stood nearby, also frozen in position. But Emily knew what she saw. The first guard had waved at her, just a tiny movement, so quick that no one else had noticed. It was his little secret. A woman standing next to them leaned over and smiled. "You know," she said, "I've been coming here for years, and I've never seen a guard move like that." Her husband nodded. "That soldier must have a soft spot for kids." Emily giggled. She liked the idea of that. Just then, a man in a dark suit appeared near the guards. He wasn't wearing a red uniform, but he looked important. His hands were folded behind his back, and he had a serious expression as he scanned the crowd. People started whispering again. "Who is that?" someone asked. "He looks like a palace official," another person replied. The man glanced at the guards, then at the tourists. For a brief moment, his eyes landed on Emily. His expression didn't change, but something about the way he looked at her made her father nervous. "We should probably go," her father whispered. He gently took Emily's hand again. "Come on, love. Let's grab some breakfast." Emily looked up at the guards one last time. She gave them a small wave, even though she knew they wouldn't wave back again. Then she turned and followed her parents down the sidewalk, holding Mr. Hoppy tightly in her arms. Behind them, the crowd slowly started to move on, but the moment stayed in their minds. Videos were already being uploaded to social media. Strangers who had never met before were talking and laughing together about what they had just seen. And the royal guard, the one who had knelt for a little girl in pajamas, stood silently at his post, his expression unreadable. But deep inside, he knew this was a day he would never forget. As Emily walked away with her parents, she couldn't stop thinking about the guard. She kept turning back, hoping to see him move again. But he remained still, just as before, standing tall and serious. Her father squeezed her hand gently. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go find some breakfast." Emily sighed. "But I wanted to talk to him more." Her mother smiled. "You already did something amazing, Emily. You made a royal guard move. That doesn't happen every day." Emily thought about that. She looked down at Mr. Hoppy and whispered, "Did we really do something special?" Of course, Mr. Hoppy didn't answer, but in Emily's heart, she knew the answer was yes. Meanwhile, back at the palace gates, the royal guard remained at his post. His face was serious, his body stiff, but inside, his mind was still on the little girl. It had been years since he had broken his stance like that. Royal guards were trained never to move unless absolutely necessary. They were meant to be strong, disciplined, and unemotional. But something about that little girl had reminded him of someone. His own daughter. She was around Emily's age, with the same curious eyes and playful smile. He had been away from home for weeks, standing at his post every day, following the strict rules of his duty. But in that one brief moment, Emily had made him feel like a father again, not just a soldier. The memory of kneeling down, of nodding at Mr. Hoppy, warmed his heart. He knew he had taken a risk, but he didn't regret it. Not long after, a palace official approached. The guard felt the man's presence but didn't turn his head. He knew better than to move now. The official stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back. In a low voice, he said, "You do realize that people recorded what just happened?" The guard remained silent. He had no response, no excuse. The official sighed. "The video is already spreading online. The world is going to see what you did." Still, the guard did not speak. He knew he had broken the rules, but deep down, he also knew he had done something important. The official glanced at the crowd still lingering nearby. Some people were checking their phones, sharing the moment with others. Then, to the guard's surprise, the official said something unexpected. "Sometimes, small acts of kindness mean more than rules." With that, the man walked away, leaving the guard to process those words. Back in the city, Emily and her parents found a small cafe and sat down for breakfast. As they waited for their food, her father checked his phone. His eyes widened. "Oh wow," he muttered. Emily's mother leaned over. "What is it?" He turned the phone so they could see. A video was playing. Emily's video. Someone in the crowd had posted it online, and now thousands of people were watching. Comments poured in. "This is the sweetest thing I've ever seen. That soldier has a heart of gold. Proof that even the toughest people have kindness inside them." Emily's mother smiled. "Looks like someone is becoming famous." Emily giggled, taking a bite of her toast. "Mr. Hoppy, we're on the internet." Her father chuckled, shaking his head. "This is incredible. I wonder if the soldier has seen it yet." Emily grinned. "I hope he knows I liked him." Back at Buckingham Palace, the guard remained at his post. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, a small thought crossed his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he would watch the video later. And maybe it would remind him that sometimes, even the smallest moments could make a big difference. As Emily happily ate her breakfast, she had no idea that her simple moment with the royal guard was spreading across the internet. The video had already been shared thousands of times, and more people were watching every second. Back at Buckingham Palace, the guard remained at his post, unaware of how much attention he was getting. But inside the palace, officers and staff had already seen the video. Some were surprised, some were amused, and some even smiled at the rare moment of kindness. By the afternoon, the news had picked up the story. Headlines appeared online. "Little girl melts royal guard's heart. A moment of kindness captured on camera." A royal guard breaks tradition for the sweetest reason. People all over the world were touched by what had happened. Parents commented, saying the story reminded them of their own children. Soldiers and veterans shared the video, talking about how duty and kindness could exist together. Even some officials from Buckingham Palace had noticed the attention. But the most surprising reaction came from the palace itself. That afternoon, the royal guard finally finished his shift. He marched back inside, following his usual routine. But as he entered the barracks, a fellow guard approached him. "You're famous," the man said with a small grin. The guard frowned. "What do you mean?" The man pulled out his phone and showed him the video. It was playing on a news website, and underneath, thousands of people had left comments. The guard's eyes widened as he watched himself on the screen. He saw the little girl in pink pajamas the moment he bent down, and the small nod he gave to her stuffed bunny. He hadn't realized how much emotion had been captured in that short interaction. He scrolled through some of the comments. This is the kind of story the world needs right now. Even the strongest men have soft hearts. This guard reminded us that kindness is powerful. He felt a warmth in his chest. He had spent years training to be strong, disciplined, and unmoving. But in that one small moment, he had broken the rules just a little, for a reason that felt right. A higher-ranking officer entered the room, and the other guards straightened up. The officer glanced at the soldier and said, "You caused quite a stir today." The guard stood tall. "Yes, sir." The officer sighed, then shook his head with a slight smile. "Don't do it again." "But, well done." The guard blinked. He hadn't expected that. He gave a firm nod. "Yes, sir." Meanwhile, Emily and her family had finished breakfast and were walking through London, completely unaware of how famous she had become. Her father checked his phone again and gasped. "Emily," he said, kneeling down to show her. "Look, everyone is talking about you and the guard." Emily's eyes widened as she saw the video. She watched herself waving, holding up Mr. Hoppy and the soldier bending down. Her smile grew bigger. "They like Mr. Hoppy too," she said excitedly. Her mother laughed. "Yes, and they like you, and the guard as well." Emily thought for a moment. "Can we go back and say thank you to him?" Her father hesitated. "I don't think we can just walk up to him again, sweetheart." But as they spoke, a message arrived on his phone. It was from a reporter. "Would your daughter like to meet the guard again?" Emily's eyes sparkled. "Really?" Her parents looked at each other. This trip was turning out to be more special than they ever imagined. And little did Emily know, she was about to get a royal surprise. Emily's father read the message again, making sure he wasn't imagining it. A reporter had just asked if Emily wanted to meet the guard again. He showed the message to his wife, who covered her mouth in surprise. "This is incredible," she whispered. Emily, sitting on a bench with Mr. Hoppy in her lap, kicked her little legs excitedly. "Are we really going back? Can I say thank you?" Her father smiled. "It looks like we might get a special invitation." They replied to the message, and within minutes they received more details. The reporter explained that Buckingham Palace had seen the video. Because of all the positive attention, they wanted to arrange a meeting between Emily and the guard in a more private setting. Emily clapped her hands. Yay. Her parents, still in shock, agreed to take her back to the palace in the afternoon. The excitement was growing, and people online were already talking about the possible meeting. News articles were being written, and more people were watching the video by the minute. When they arrived at Buckingham Palace later that day, a kind official greeted them at the gates. He smiled warmly at Emily. "You've become quite famous, young lady." Emily tilted her head. "Why?" The official chuckled. "Because you reminded everyone how special kindness is." He led them through a side entrance, away from the large crowds of tourists. Emily held onto her mother's hand as they walked through a beautiful hallway. The walls were decorated with golden frames and paintings, and everything looked fancy and important. Finally, they reached a quiet courtyard. And there, standing tall in his red uniform, was the guard. Emily gasped. She squeezed Mr. Hoppy and whispered, "It's him." Her parents stood back, letting her walk forward. The guard, still as disciplined as ever, watched as the little girl approached him again. But this time, they weren't surrounded by a crowd. Emily stopped in front of him and smiled. "Hello." The guard, as expected, didn't respond right away. But then, to everyone's surprise, he did something unexpected again. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He held it out to Emily. She looked at it curiously. It was a shiny golden pin shaped like a crown. "For you," the guard said softly. The crowd watching from a distance gasped. A royal guard speaking. This was even rarer than him moving. Emily's eyes widened. "For me?" she asked, carefully taking the pin. The guard gave her a small nod. "You reminded me of someone special. And he reminded me that even in the toughest jobs, kindness is important." Emily smiled the biggest smile ever. She carefully pinned the golden crown onto Mr. Hoppy's ear. "Now he's a royal bunny," she giggled. The guard's lips twitched slightly, almost like he wanted to smile. Emily looked up at him. "Thank you for being my friend." The guard straightened his posture again, but gave her a small, almost invisible nod, just like he had done before. Her father captured the moment on his phone. This was more than just a meeting. This was something special, something people would remember forever. As Emily walked back to her parents, she turned and gave the guard one last wave. And though no one else noticed, she was sure she saw it. A tiny, secret wave back. The meeting with the royal guard had been everything Emily dreamed of and more. She walked away from Buckingham Palace with Mr. Hoppy proudly wearing his golden crown pin. The moment was more magical than she could have imagined, and her parents couldn't stop talking about how special it was. That night, after they returned to their hotel, Emily carefully placed Mr. Hoppy on the bed next to her and tucked him in. She smiled at the golden crown pin, making sure it was just right on his ear. "You're a royal bunny now, Mr. Hoppy, just like the guard." Her mother tucked Emily into bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You made so many people smile today." Emily smiled back. "I'm happy I made the guard smile, too." Her father, who had been looking at his phone, looked up and said, "You know, sweetheart, the story about you and the guard has gone viral. It's everywhere now. People are still talking about it, even today." "Really?" Emily asked, her eyes wide. "Yes," her father continued. "And I think it's a reminder that kindness can spread. You didn't just say hello to a soldier. You touched the hearts of people all around the world." Emily giggled. "I didn't mean to be famous. I just wanted to say hello." Her parents laughed, and they kissed her goodnight, leaving the room quiet and peaceful. The next morning, as they were leaving their hotel, Emily's father received a call from a reporter. The story about Emily's meeting with the royal guard had spread so far that even news stations were asking for interviews. They were fascinated by how such a small, simple moment could bring so much joy to so many people. Though Emily was still a little confused about all the attention, she was happy to know that her small act of kindness had made a difference. It made her feel proud, but most of all, it made her realize how special the guard's small acts of kindness had been. Back at Buckingham Palace, life had returned to its normal rhythm. The royal guard stood at their posts, as always, with their serious faces and rigid movements. But something had changed. For the guard who had spoken to Emily, the memory of that day stayed with him. He had seen the video of Emily and her family. The little girl's pure joy had reminded him of his own family, his daughter, who he missed terribly while he was on duty. That day, as he stood at his post, a small voice inside him told him that kindness could still be shown, even in a job that required strict rules. He would always remember Emily and the way her smile had softened his heart. And though he didn't move or speak, he now carried a secret smile in his heart. Days passed, and life moved on for both Emily and the royal guard. Emily returned to her regular life, but every time she saw Mr. Hoppy, she thought of the guard and the kindness they had shared. She often told her parents stories of the guard, imagining that he was her friend, standing tall and strong at his post. The video continued to inspire people, and the world was reminded that even in places where rules seemed unbreakable, small acts of kindness could make a huge difference. Emily had shown that even a little girl in pajamas could change the world just by being kind. And the royal guard, he would always remember the little girl who had made him smile, and the moment when he had bent the rules just a little, for a reason that had been well worth it. The end.